So this is our last panel, but I think it's going to be a really interesting one. We're going to talk about how we glue this whole ecosystem together. And we really have kind of a diverse group of organizations here that I think will give you a sense of what the opportunities are to create this ecosystem, to take all the pieces we've been learning about and make this work as a real system, and why Houston might be unique to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jose Beceiro, who has just come over, I guess, within the last 6 months to the Greater Houston Partnership, and is doing an amazing job of running their the partnership's Energy 2.0 program. So Jose, welcome. Thank you for doing this, and I'll let you introduce your panel.
Well, thank you very much, Brett. We really do appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience today about energy transition and the role of facilitators and foundations in the low carbon future. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I just wanted to give a little background about what we're doing at the Greater Houston Partnership. The Greater Houston Partnership being the regional chamber of commerce for the Houston region, we actually represent a 12-county region around the Houston area. And we serve the business community in terms of economic development, policy and advocacy development. We run a number of business-oriented events and programming, and we serve the business community in a number of other ways as well. One of the key ways that we're serving the energy sector is by launching the Houston region into the Energy 2.0 economy. And so energy transition is a central focus for the future of the Houston economic region. And we just wanted to mention that some of the work that we are doing at the Greater Houston Partnership, first off, as the energy capital of the world, Houston is the headquarters and intellectual capital for virtually every segment of the energy industry. The world around us is changing, and as the industry evolves and the risks of climate change are ever increasing, Houston is uniquely positioned to lead the transition to a cleaner, more efficient, and more sustainable low carbon world. Many people recognize Houston as being the global energy capital. We have over 4,500 energy companies. Over 250,000 people in Houston are employed in the energy sector, which translates into about 1/3 of our regional GDP. However, some of the things that may be a surprise to our audience is that the Houston region is also the largest clean energy economy in the state of Texas, and actually 7th largest nationally. We have over 210 clean energy companies, 100 solar companies, 30 wind energy companies, and about 80 digital technology companies. And that is really a key part to the energy transition work that we are doing, is recruiting other pieces of the energy value chain into Houston, especially around digital technologies, to increase the level of digitization that is being adopted and implemented in the energy sector. So the momentum that we are generating in Houston is significant, and we really are working towards the goal of Houston, Texas, continuing to be the energy capital of the world, and especially when it comes to energy transition. So with that in mind, I would first off like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to go ahead and mention each panelist by name, but then I'm going to hand it off to each panelist to do a further introduction of themselves, and to ask them to talk a few minutes about their organization and the work that they're doing. So first of all, our distinguished speakers include Dr. Paula Gant, who is a Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Innovation at the Gas Technology Institute. We also have Dr. Adam Kuspa, who is the President of the Welch Foundation. We have Jetta Wong, who's a Senior Fellow of Clean Energy Innovation of the Clean Energy Innovation Program at the Innovation Technology and Information Foundation. We have James Mackey, who's the Managing Director of OGCI Climate Investments. And we also have Drew Nelson, who's the Program Officer of the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. So with that, I'm going to first ask Dr. Paula Gant to introduce herself and give us a bit more detail on her work.
Thanks, Jose. Thrilled to be here today, even if I can't be in Houston in person with all of you. It's great to have this opportunity. I spent the formative years of my career in Houston, and I have great appreciation and affection for how the economic ecosystem in Houston organizes itself to tackle complex challenges. I have no doubt that conferences like this and the collaborations that come out of them are going to make sure that Houston is well situated to continue to do that as we navigate through energy transition. And energy transition is upon us. At the Gas Technology Institute, where we are a nonprofit R&D organization, focused on select areas where we can influence clean energy transition. We've been thinking about the challenge before us, and particularly our role in delivering solutions that leverage gases, liquid fuels, and infrastructure in the low carbon, low cost energy systems of the future. And those words are chosen very, very carefully and intentionally. When we think about energy transition, we believe there are two imperatives: that we must get to economy-wide deep decarbonization, particularly looking at the solutions we need post-2030. So that's well beyond buildings and light-duty transport, well beyond electrons across our entire economy. And that also we need to invest to innovate the solutions that deliver that at lower cost even than what we have now. If we are going to make sure that this transition is just for all the communities here in North America that it needs to serve, as well as position us to export their technologies and solutions to make a difference around the planet as we enable removal of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere and raising standards of living across the globe. So I want to spend a couple of minutes and more minutes in my introductory remarks explaining why we feel that is so urgent and how that's guiding our thinking at GTI. Basically, we're expecting disruption. We're expecting disruptive innovation. And it's many of it, much is upon us. I know y'all probably talked about it in a lot of these sessions today and last week or inside conversations. Digital technologies are just poised to reshape world energy markets. We've got a new wave of industrial innovation. I think Amy Jaffe probably talked about this. It's coming out in her new book. She's going to be profiling it. I think she probably talked about it here last week. That's driven by the convergence of automation, artificial intelligence, big data analytics, and it's just beginning to suggest a remaking of energy systems. And even this year, as we've dealt with global pandemic, and we've seen the impacts of this as economies have moved abruptly away from commerce and services that require a physical presence and towards virtual and digital solutions. So you take these digital and automation trends and you combine that with what we've seen as an increasing spend on energy R&D across the globe for the last few years. And we still see corporations remaining as the largest source of energy innovation in terms of total dollars, but government spending plays a big role, and it's on the rise. So we see in the private sector, and we're going to talk about the government a little bit later, but in the private sector, we're seeing the efforts in the investments innovation are increasingly open in form, tuned to short cycle times, targeting business structures and technologies, and accelerating to scale faster. As a result of those forces, we expect that disruptive innovation is going to be pervasive and persistent through any of our planning horizons, within and across economic sectors. And that results from three forces we see: urgency in achieving desired outcomes. For example, a company or a locality implementing a decarbonization goal. The awareness of the increased impact and probability of success that is afforded by collaboration and open innovation approaches, noted earlier, the open form innovation, and just the sheer volume and access to digital and data tools. So we're seeing this reflected in companies setting lofty goals for their transition of their business, particularly in the energy space. Now to mid-century, a lot of net zero commitments have been made, even in this year. In the middle of economic stall and pandemic, not a lot of detail on exactly how those plans will be enacted, but some signals that we're starting to get about where companies are going to invest their efforts in the near term. And we're seeing investor appetite for investing in breakthrough solutions as well. So a lot of churn, a lot of disruption, an urgent need to get solutions to market at scale. And I'll close out by saying that is going to require enormous amounts of collaboration at scale across lines that we're not traditionally used to reaching across. And that's why forums like this are so important, to get people thinking out of their box. Thanks, Jose.
That's great, Paula. I really do appreciate it. And that's certainly what we're seeing in Houston in terms of the increasing presence of the tech industry and startups pursuing new energy technology innovation. So that is really just a key point. Next, our next speaker, Dr. Adam Kuspa. Adam, welcome.
Thank you, Jose. And thanks for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure to be able to tell you a little bit about the Welch Foundation. For those of you that do not know about the Welch Foundation, we've been in Houston for over 65 years. We're a basic science grant-making foundation. So for the past 60 years, we've traditionally made about 400 grants a year, 3-year grants in basic science, chemistry, and related fields. And how this relates to today's topic, I would say, although about half of our current grant portfolio is in the area of biochemistry, the other half has to do with chemistry, atmospheric science, materials science, chemical engineering, all of which we feel relate directly to the problem that we're discussing today. A new initiative that we might mention a little bit later is our collaboration with the Rice University, initiating the Welch Institute. And so this is a transition for the foundation in adding this new program, going from a grant-making organization of making small grants throughout the state of Texas to having a more focused effort in advanced materials. And although we've just begun to stand up the Institute, we hope that the Welch Institute will be part of the conversation of the energy transition of the future. We hope to be able to hire world-class basic scientists who will be pushing the forefront of advanced materials. We'd like to try to take advantage of the interaction between advanced materials and the computational sciences, which is on the rise. And it's obvious to this audience that when you want to talk about low carbon energy production, storage, movement, you're talking about using advanced materials. And since our mandate is on the basic science side, I would suggest, as I'm generally an optimist, we're hoping that we will have discoveries and innovations we haven't even thought about yet, which will impact our journey to a carbon-free future. And from that, with respect to the conversation today, I am mainly concerned about shortening the cycle time from basic science discovery to put those discoveries on the innovation pathway. In my previous career as a laboratory scientist in biomedical research, in the previous 40 years, I saw the cycle time shrink for getting new medicines to market from 20 years to maybe 10 years. And we've all seen what's happened with the coronavirus vaccine. I'm sure that's happening in the energy industry, and we'd be very interested in collaborating and being part of the conversation, even though we're on the very, very basic discovery science side of the equation.
That's great, Adam. And we are just absolutely thrilled about the Welch Foundation's investment at Rice around advancing materials. We look forward to hearing more about the launch of that institute going forward. Next speaker, Jetta Wong. Jetta, welcome.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for moderating this panel, and thank you to the Center for Houston's Future for hosting this summit. It is a pleasure to be with you and the rest of the panelists today. You already heard a little bit about me during the opening session, so let me tell you a little bit about the Information Technology Innovation Foundation and what we've been doing in the energy innovation space. So first of all, ITIF is an independent 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education institute focused on policy solutions focused on policy solutions that accelerate innovation and boost productivity to spur growth and opportunity and progress across the country. ITIF focuses on a host of critical issues at the intersection of technological innovation and public policy, especially including clean energy. Under the leadership of Professor David Hart, ITIF's Clean Energy Program has become a go-to source of information for energy innovation policy with in-depth reports on the state of the country's innovation ecosystem and the important policy levers and funding levels that are required to keep the United States competitive in a growing global innovation economy. And the thing that I'm really excited about and what I'd like to tell you a little bit more about today is the work that I've done over the last few years with David Hart to investigate the idea to create a Department of Energy Foundation. And it's something that we published a report on in May this year. The report is based on 140 interviews and extensive research into 9 other foundations that have been created by Congress for other federal agencies like the US Department of Energy, the National Institutes for Health, the Centers for Disease Control, even the Park Service has their own foundation. Now, what we're talking about is trying to create one for the Department of Energy. In our research, and what we came up with is what we're calling an Energy Technology Commercialization Foundation. It would have a mission to strengthen US competitiveness in a carbon-constrained world. And the objective of the foundation is to do exactly what Paula was talking about earlier, accelerate innovation, trying to bring new commercial technologies to scale. So the objective is to bring new innovations to the market to achieve deep decarbonization of our economy, required to keep below the global warming 2 degrees Celsius. So the foundation would support organizations like, for example, the Center for Houston's Future, or you heard from earlier Greentown Labs, or many of the universities that spoke about the work that they're doing, and others in a collaborative way. These organizations catalyze and incubate collaborations among private, public, and philanthropic communities to accelerate the commercialization of early stage technologies. They help to make the complex and often messy innovation process more strategic. Organizations like OGCI or GTI bring specific skills and expertise to these kinds of collaborations, filling in the important holes of the innovation process or helping to bridge that valley of death that we talked about earlier today. The foundation's role would be to lift up the great work that's already going on across the country in these organizations and to connect them to the technical capabilities supported by the Department of Energy, most of which is basic science, similar to what Adam just talked about. Because the Energy Technology Commercialization Foundation would be authorized by Congress, it would have a special relationship with the Department of Energy that would allow it to collaborate and coordinate with DOE managers and DOE scientists, something that normal organizations do not have. You can't just knock on DOE's door and say, hey, can we talk about something? It's not really how it works. The foundation would have 2 main collaboration strategies. The first one would support national cross-cutting challenges in hard to decarbonize sectors. And the second one would be to strengthen regional energy innovation ecosystems. These 2 collaboration strategies focus the foundation on activities important to the country and to reducing carbon emissions, and strategies that the Department of Energy isn't necessarily focused on. These collaborations would also help get technologies through the valley of death, preparing them for commercial demonstration with private sector partners. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about why private sector partners are important in this process. Since publishing our study, I should say the ITIF study, a bipartisan provision to establish this foundation was included in the House of Representatives bill, the energy bill that just passed just a couple of weeks ago. And we're optimistic, I'm a perpetual optimist, that if there is a Senate package, that this foundation could also be included in that. So I know we're going to talk about the foundation a little bit more, so I will leave it at that, and back to you, Jose.
Great. Thank you, Jetta, and thanks for describing the opportunity with the new DOE Foundation initiative. It really is game changing. Our next speaker, James Mackey. James, welcome.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you to all the panelists and participants joining today. Really pleased to be joining this group to talk about how Houston can really take a leadership position in the transition, not just for Texas, but for the world, because of course we all know that while emissions are produced locally, they have impact globally. OGCI Climate Investments is the investment arm of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. As Paula talked earlier about collaboration across companies and industries, our LPs are 11 of the largest oil majors that generally compete with each other, but recognize the importance of pooling their resources for the shared benefit of transitioning the energy economy and working with each other to prepare their businesses for leadership in the future. The initiative part of OGCI focuses very much on policy advocacy and operational standards to reduce the carbon footprint of the oil and gas industry. And then they created the Climate Investments Fund about 3 years ago, which is focused on deploying capital for advancing early stage technologies and implementation projects that can decarbonize not just the energy industry, but also, all heavy industry. So that's an element of collaboration, not just across companies, but across multiple industries. As we often talk about the energy transition, I think a lot of people really focus on the electrification of parts of our energy sector and the economy. Things like reducing fossil fuel use for power generation in favor of wind, solar, and batteries, or electrification of the transportation sector. And those are things that are crucial to what we're trying to do in reducing global warming. But an important element of the energy transition is a recognition that there are other industries that are not easily electrified. Things like steel and cement, where just the heat that is necessary for those manufacturing processes cannot be done with wind and solar. So an important element is trying to reduce the carbon footprint of those businesses where they exist today. So one of the focuses of climate investments is to fund technologies and projects that will demonstrate business models for those things. And we have 3 verticals that we are focused on. One is reducing methane emissions, which is primarily focused around the oil and gas industry. And then we have 2 areas that focus on carbon dioxide. One is just in the reduction of carbon dioxide in processes in both the industrial and transportation sectors, but then also what we refer to as recycling of CO2. And there's 2 general areas where we would bucket recycling of CO2. The first would be carbon capture, usage, and sequestration, where we're capturing CO2 from large industrial processes and then sequestering it underground. And we can also repurpose that CO2 in a number of ways. One that many people in Houston are familiar with is enhanced oil recovery, but there are other areas such as using CO2 as a feedstock for other products, such as cement, going back to cement and concrete. One of our portfolio companies not only reduces the amount of CO2 in the cement manufacturing process, but they've created an alternative cement product that substitutes CO2 for water in the curing process, such that the finished product has not just a reduced CO2 footprint, but also uses 80% less water. So those are some examples of the innovation that our portfolio has been pursuing. One other thing I'll note is that there's a lot of support that comes from foundations and government agencies and nonprofits. Our fund we are a for-profit investment fund. And that's important to us, not just because we like profits like everybody else, but we firmly believe that in order for our work to have a multiplier effect, our investments need to demonstrate that they are not just operationally, but also economically attractive, because we want to encourage other participants and investors to come in and follow what we've been doing and invest in similar asset classes going forward, because we're a $1 billion fund, which is a big number, but in the grand scheme of what we're trying to accomplish, it's a very, very small fraction, and we need more help.
Yeah, that's great, James. And thank you for offering that perspective that in order to be successful with energy transition, we need to be creating business models and policy solutions and technology solutions for the entire spectrum of the energy sector. So thank you for that. And last but certainly not least, Drew Nelson. Drew, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Jose, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. And I think it's safe to say that Mr. Mitchell was one of the foremost innovators that Texas has ever seen. Not only in his idea of let's put a whole bunch of high pressure water a mile underground and see if we can get a bunch of oil and gas out of that rock, but also, hey, let's build a suburb 30 miles north of Houston. And instead of tearing down all the trees, let's make the trees a central part of why you would want to live here and be closer to nature. And so Mr. Mitchell has always had a sustainability lens and a sustainability focus on the work that he's done. And that was primarily driven by his focus on the science and asking the question of if we have issues in the world today with, at his time, 4 billion people, what is the world going to look like when there's 9 billion people? And so those are some of the key questions that we, as the foundation and Mr. Mitchell himself, have been wrestling with since our formation. And it's because of Mr. Mitchell and his wife that there is the Cynthia and George Mitchell Woodlands Pavilion, where I saw some wonderful concerts when I was growing up in Houston, Texas. And it's because of Mr. Mitchell and the foundation that there's an endowed program of work on sustainability at the National Academies of Science. And there's endowed chairs or programs across Texas on subjects as varying as marine science, physics, sustainability economics, petroleum engineering. And there's also the Houston Advanced Research Center, which is looking in a think tank lens of how to make the area of Southeast Texas more sustainable. And so, it's been a key part of what we are trying to do. And I think it's now more important than ever, because you look at some of the issues that are out there with regard to climate change, not just in terms of the disruption that might come from that with the impacts of climate change, but what are the economic disruptions that could come? And recall, most of us 10 years ago thought we were entering into a period of scarcity in US oil and gas, or maybe 15 years ago. And because of hydraulic fracturing and the shale development, that's not the case anymore. And disruption happens, and it happens fast, and it takes people by surprise. So are we in Texas, in the Houston area, are we going to be positioned to take advantage of that disruption? Or are we destined to become like a Detroit and lose a huge amount of our revenue and our population base? And I think because of the know-how and the ingenuity and the commitment that we have in Houston, we're poised to do the next level and to continue our role as energy leaders. But that requires some foresight and some planning. And so what we're trying to do at the foundation is look at what are the policy issues and what are the policy hurdles that need to be unlocked in Texas in order for continued energy leadership in the state. And we've looked at a couple different options, but we think that there's a really great hope for the Houston area and for Texas writ large on carbon capture and storage and on hydrogen development. And honestly, if I had $1 for every time I've heard someone say, if you can't make CCS work in Houston, you can't make it work anywhere, I'd probably have enough to fund a CCS project in Houston. But so what are the hurdles to getting those CCS projects up and running? And what can be done at the state level with policy levers to make that happen? So we have funded Rice University to pull together a group of stakeholders from the oil and gas sector, from the industrial sector, from the academic sector, and from the nonprofit sector, from non-governmental organizations, to ask the question of what can we do collectively to reduce industrial emissions while maintaining the important economic driver that sector has for the state. And hopefully pretty soon there will be a CCS policy roadmap for the state of Texas that Rice has developed in conversations with all of these various stakeholders. And so I think that's a tangible example of a foundation trying to understand where are the gaps, where are the hurdles, what are the policy levers that we can pull, and bringing people together to try to pull those levers and move things forward. So there's other examples which I'll talk about later in the panel, but I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Jose, and my apologies for the technical difficulties earlier.
No problem, Drew. And thank you again for your leadership and the Mitchell Foundation's leadership in driving forward the policy conversations around energy transition. It really has been instrumental and a great reminder, the speakers on this panel, it's a great reminder of the diverse set of stakeholders that are all coming together collaboratively to address the issue of climate change and also energy transition. So moving right into our question set, the first set of questions is related to the issues in funding energy innovation. And the first question, I'll direct this to Paula, if you don't mind. The question would be, you've worked at DOE, and can you describe the role that DOE plays in funding energy innovation? And along those lines, what is the role of public funding for energy research? What organizations in the federal government perform this role, and why can't that role be carried out by industry?
Really good set of questions, Jose, and I'm going to kind of take them backwards to front. I was had the privilege of managing the Office of Oil and Gas at DOE in the last administration, and this was after a period where for 10 years there had been a view that we didn't need the federal government to fund oil and gas R&D, and that had been reflected in budgets, and we were able to turn that around. So a lot of experience at this sort of intersection of helping increase understanding of what is the role of DOE, because it's one of those sort of misunderstood institutions in the federal government. We all tend to think like we have our hand on an elephant and therefore we've described the elephant, and we find out there's not just one elephant even that we haven't mapped out. There's like a bunch of them in this whole ecosystem, right? DOE is very diverse. I mean, it is our national sort of office department of technology, science, transition of our economy that's underpinned our economic quality of life in so many vital ways for decades now. It was, importantly to remember, it was formed in a time of energy scarcity where we felt vulnerable from a national security perspective. I grew up in Lake Charles, Louisiana, spent a lot of my teen years in Houston, and very familiar with with the ups and downs of the economic cycles that were to some extent driven by our concerns about dependence on foreign oil, right? So what did we do about that? Well, we innovated the heck out of it, thanks to Mr. Mitchell and others, through programs that were funded by the Office of Oil and Gas at the U.S. Department of Energy. And that was relentless persistence and scientific exploration and taking that data and asking questions over a couple of decades that ultimately, through that series of repetitive inquiry and the ecosystem that is DOE, but certainly thanks to Mr. Mitchell's persistence, we are now in an era of energy abundance with regard to domestic oil and gas that happens to intersect with a broad array of energy abundance across energy sources and fuels, whether it's wind, solar, energy efficiency, see the earlier disruptions that digital technologies are providing. So we're seeing DOE's mission shift from one of ensuring that we have energy abundance to one of accelerating the transition to clean and resilient energy systems. And there is a global competition to do this, and a lot of climate and economic imperatives that underpin it. It is the very nature of this challenge requires open innovation. It requires collaboration. As James pointed out, I mean, private investors that are traditionally fierce competitors, like those members of OGCI, see the challenge and the opportunity requiring open collaboration and in collaboration with government. So DOE, the ecosystem is way too complicated for me to describe in a 90-second spot. It touches basically almost every aspect of our life. And as Adam pointed to, I think earlier, if we're looking at decarbonization and energy transition, we're looking well beyond electrons to transitioning our industrial and manufacturing base, chemicals, materials, liquid fuels, you name it. As Drew pointed out, industrial decarbonization is going to be a part of it. the Houston ecosystem plugging into the Department of Energy ecosystem is going to be one of the ways we supercharge that and get to goal.
Yeah, and Paula, the follow-on question there, the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy released a report recently called Energizing America, calling for a 3x increase in federal spending and energy R&D. Can you discuss the current level of DOE spending on energy, and do you feel that we're under investing as a country in this area?
Well, I feel like a bit of the second expert certainly on this, because Jetta certainly, I hope, will chime in on this with regard to DOE's budget and where it's been and where it's headed in the coming years. I'd like to take this moment just to reinforce the sense of urgency of we've had increasing federal budgets for R&D. The Columbia ITF book that just came out, Energizing America, makes this case very compellingly about why we need to ramp it up. But I'm just going to take a moment to reinforce that point, that we are seeing in this time of crisis this year, as we go through global pandemic and economic stall, a scale of intervention in economies around the world that is unprecedented. So far this year, there have been announced $11 trillion of economic stimulus globally. And in each of those stimulus, outside of the US, because we haven't gotten there yet, now in each of those stimulus policies, national governments are giving greater attention to domestic clean energy transitions and technology investments. And they are explicitly saying they are doing this to maintain the competitiveness of trade exposed industries, to generate new areas of competitiveness and to stimulate their local economies. So the game is on at a global level. And even if you look at just hydrogen alone, and you look at the announcements that France and Germany have made in these stimulus programs, they're basically just trying to announce a bigger number than the country before them announced, right? And that signals very serious intent, for example, with how much hydrogen production they're going to build. The game is afoot, and it's time for us to make sure that we're very serious about ramping up, particularly our clean energy innovation agenda. And Jetta, I know you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on everything that you said, especially related to US competitiveness. I think one of the really great things about energy innovation is that it's a nonpartisan issue. I mean, we have seen both sides of the aisle care about energy innovation because they see the value that innovation brings to our country. They understand what Mitchell has done. They see and know that story. And so we have seen increased budgets for the Department of Energy for the last several years. And I think that is something that we will continue to see. I would only add that it's not just the Department of Energy. The Energizing America report really smartly goes into the fact that it is not just DOE that we need to be seeing energy innovation activities out of. We need it at USDA, the Department of Commerce, NASA, all Department of Defense. Those are very important agencies that also have important innovation and R&D activities that we need to be thinking about as we decarbonize our economy. So I think when we're starting to talk about the different kinds of industrial processes that we want to be decarbonizing, we need to be thinking about the Department of Defense, and we need to be thinking about the Department of Commerce and USDA, and they need our help. So I think that that's a great opportunity for inventors and startups all around the country.
Yeah, and on that point, Jetta, could you also touch briefly on the role of national labs? At your work at DOE, you helped to improve the translation of basic research performed by national labs into commercial products and services. Can you describe some of the issues with the commercialization of technology coming out of our national labs?
Sure, absolutely. And it's a great question. And I should say, it's not just national labs, right? We heard earlier that Adam and many other foundations, and I presented in the opening panel or opening discussion this morning, that we've seen $2.3 billion just in 2017 for the basic science space coming from philanthropic groups. Well, we also know that the Department of Energy and the federal government in general funds the basic science, which is great because it is the seed corn for innovation. And a lot of that, at least at the Department of Energy, goes to our national laboratories, but also to universities. And like any scientist at any academic organization or national laboratory, they don't necessarily have the skill set to think about commercialization. And this really kind of became clear to me when I worked for the US House of Representatives Science, Space, and Technology Committee. I would have amazing scientists come in and tell me about some whiz-bang new material or quirk that they identified and what they saw up in space, and they were so excited, and I was excited for them. And then in the afternoon, maybe I would have a private sector company come in and they would be telling me about their research, which would be all about markets, reducing price, making sure the product fit the market, making sure that they had customers. And it was very clear that there was a huge gap between what the scientists were talking about and what the private sector companies were trying to commercialize. And that's the same gap that we talked about earlier with the Valley of Death, and the gap that is really hard to overcome for national laboratory scientists. So there's a lot that's going on to help kind of close that gap, and the different organizations that are on this panel and that you heard from earlier, provide those different resources and connections to the private sector and investors to help close that gap, to speed up, accelerate the innovation that we want to see to really reduce climate change, reduce carbon emissions.
Great. Thank you, Jetta. And James, I see you nodding in agreement, so I'd certainly like for you to weigh in if you'd like. But also, I'd like to toss out another question for you, James. Switching gears a little bit to alternative funding models and facilitators. Can you talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the various existing models of energy finance?
Sure. I think a way to look at it, to frame it, is to stick on the point that Jetta made about that Valley of Death, because for different technologies and methods of addressing problems with infrastructure, where you are in the commercialization and adoption of particular technologies will kind of drive what financing elements are available. So, for instance, when you're way past the Valley of Death and you have TRL9 technology that's accepted everywhere, and it has an economic value that is competitive in a free market, you don't need any help, you don't need any subsidies. Something can be financed just based on the cash flows generated by revenues that the market will pay. So that would be traditional project finance for, let's just say, a natural gas-fired power plant, where it's not really getting any help from the public sector. It's getting equity and bank or bond debt that is simply sized for the debt service coverage that its operating income can provide. When you look at things that are not quite so advanced, then they need help. So, for instance, things that are early in their development and kind of just entering that Valley of Death, where really no private investor wants to touch it because they don't see their way to a return. That's where grants come in from foundations and public sources such as the DOE. That's the type of funding that is really helpful for demonstration products and projects in what I would call sort of the pre-commercial level. And that's a situation where, if you want to boil it down to having costs that are above market levels, those excess costs are being borne by an investor who has something beyond economic incentives for putting their money in. As things move on and they're becoming commercial, but they may not be the lowest cost, so they're not quite ready to compete on a heads-up basis. Two very common financing structures that we see globally are things that I'd call rate-based, rate-based financing models, and then subsidy models. Rate-based would be things like feed-in tariffs that we've seen in Europe and Canada for things like wind and solar. Also in the US, we do have things that I would classify as rate-based schemes where we have certain quotas in regulated industries, such as if you take the electric power industry, rate regulated utilities in different states often have to acquire a certain portion of their resources from renewable sources. They refer to it as a renewable portfolio standard. So they will have a market-based way to go procure, but because they have the requirement to have a certain portion in the resource base, they may pay more for that portion than they would if they were simply just looking at everything only on economics. And then the last element I'd say, and I guess one thing that I would say about that is in those rate-based structures, the above market costs are being borne primarily by the consumers because it translates into higher rates that they would pay to their local utility. And then the last would be kind of a subsidy model, which in the US, we have this fascination with doing things through tax incentives. So in the renewable energy industry, investment tax credits and production tax credits have been used for wind and solar. They've demonstrated great success because those programs have been around for years, and now as they are starting to be phased out, we're seeing the technologies that they were supporting become the least cost resources available. So there are places in parts of the US where without subsidy, a wind or a solar project would have a lower levelized cost of energy than building a new combined cycle gas project. And that would not have occurred without these subsidies providing them support. That successful model is being applied for carbon capture because the Section 45Q tax credits are modeled after the wind production tax credits, and they are going to start being deployed over the next several years. And that's actually something that's welcome to the tax equity market because they see a new source of a new revenue channel as wind and solar no longer will be needed. One of the downsides for that tax subsidy model is it requires that the participant that's monetizing the subsidy have sufficient taxable income in order to take advantage of it. That can have a little bit of a depressing effect on the entrepreneurial participation of developers because many developers don't have the taxable income to do it, so that if you're going to use those credits, you may have to bring in a third-party tax investor, which adds additional complexity and cost to the financing. So it's an imperfect method, but it's something that has demonstrated success. And as someone who's, very enthusiastic about growing carbon capture, I'm glad that we have, at least that methodology to use. And it is a more advanced level of policy support than what we're seeing in most jurisdictions around the world.
Appreciate that, James. Thank you very, very much. And Jetta, do you want to weigh in on the different funding models, and can you discuss the philanthropic model that you've been talking about?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Jose. First of all, I would say that, as I think James started out with, we need all of these different kinds of funding models. Different technologies will need different things. They're at different stages of development. And as we started out this conversation, we need to accelerate innovation. We have a crisis on our hands right now. We see it every day in the news. We feel it in our homes. We know what's going on. We need to deal with climate change. So we should be thinking about all of these different kinds of tax credits and incentive models for all these different technologies. And the Congress has a lot to do in this space. So I encourage people to think about that. For the Department of Energy Foundation, what I'm really excited about is the fact that we think that there's an opportunity to bring more private sector investment into this energy space. We hear all the time, and I think maybe during the break, we were talking about how earlier in the discussion that some people don't think that the problem is necessarily with investment anymore. It's more that we need more infrastructure and connectivity in their ecosystem to really bring technology to the market where organizations like James, like OGCI can invest in these new opportunities. And so that's what we're trying to do with the Department of Energy Foundation. We're trying to put together collaborations where we have support from philanthropic dollars that are interested in supporting nonprofit organizations, or a platform for companies to come together with startups and scientists and entrepreneurs where they have a new technology, but they don't quite understand what their market looks like. They don't exactly know what that product is that's going to end up being commercialized by the private sector. And so we're trying to bring the private sector closer to these entrepreneurs so they can not only invest, but provide information about the market, provide information about the problems that they're trying to solve. So the entrepreneur knows what they're trying to target, knows what product they're trying to get into the market working with this private sector partner. So I think the philanthropic opportunity is to fund organizations like Greentown Labs, like the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, like economic development organizations that are bringing these collaborations together as a platform to then hopefully take technologies to the market. So that's one thing that we think the Department of Energy the Department of Energy Foundation can do.
Thanks, Jetta. I appreciate that. You know, in the interest of time,
Like
I
Drew
want
wanted to say something.
Yeah,
I'm
I wanted to be sure we get to Adam and Drew. Adam, I'll start with you real quick. It'd be great if you could describe a little bit more about the Welch Foundation's $100 million investment at Rice to advance for advanced materials. How do you see this investment relating to energy and climate?
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, we have high hopes for the Welch Institute. As I said, we're just standing it up. Just to be clear, it's a 501c3 joint venture with Rice. It's a support org of Rice University. We're currently in the process of recruiting a president, executive director, and the scientists that will actually work in the foundation. So I can't promise this audience exactly what the Institute will be doing, but I would just offer that as you've all worked out for yourselves, advanced material, basic science and advanced materials is almost a contradiction in terms, because most advanced material scientists have a endpoint in mind, a problem they're trying to solve before they begin their basic investigations on how to make materials. So we have expectations that the scientists working at the Institute will be part of the conversation around advancing a low carbon energy future, but we can't really say exactly how that will happen.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate that. And Drew, about the Mitchell Foundation, you know, you're already working on climate issues, clean energy issues. Can you just discuss some of the projects that you're working on, and how do you see the foundation strategy evolving now that the first non-Mitchell family member is leading the foundation?
Oh yeah, thanks, Jose. And hopefully my internet won't crash this time when I start speaking. But you know, I just want to rewind a couple seconds, if I could, to put into another point about the finance models. You know, there's a reason why Texas leads the nation in wind power. And that's because under two Republican governors, Bush and Perry, we made a huge investment as a state in transmission to get wind power from West Texas and North Texas to the urban loads. And we unleashed the power of markets, and that's what we have seen. And there were tax credits, and there was all sorts of incentives that came as part of this. But I think it's more than that. We need more than just a 45Q. We need to figure out ways to incentivize the market. And I think that's why it's so important that the work that a number of folks are doing are, how do you take CO2 and turn it into a product that is an input into other products as opposed to a waste stream. And so I think there's a huge amount of potential there for Texas, for the Houston area. And you know, I think there's a huge amount of potential when it comes to direct air capture as well. I mean, Texas is potentially the Saudi Arabia. Texas is potentially the Texas of direct air capture, and we just need to figure out a way to tap that market and unleash the power of innovation. And so I just wanted to put that in there for food for thought for the other conversation. With regard to your question, Jose, you know, I think there's just a lot of interesting policy levers that could be pulled that build on our market structure And building on something that Jetta said earlier, clean energy in Texas is incredibly popular. I think it's something like 95% of Texans, no matter what your political affiliation, think we should have more clean energy. And so, you know, there's lots of stuff that we could do that brings in new good jobs that build on that clean energy future. But there's often not a sense of how do we get there. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is the Mitchell Foundation and a couple of other funders have gotten some funding to Michael Weber at the University of Texas to come up with some scenarios for how Texas could get to net zero emissions by 2050. And there'll be different scenarios, and there'll be a tool. So if you don't like the scenarios that Dr. Weber and his team have come up with, you can go online and you can plug in whatever assumptions that you want to make: 100% clean energy, 100% nuclear, 100% hydrogen, whatever the case may be. And you can kind of see how we as a state can get there. And I think a study like that is going to be really important for the state as we start to think through a lot of these issues. What is the role of hydrogen? What is the role of CCS? What is the role of clean energy? And help bring it all together in one central area of policy recommendations. And so be on the lookout for that study, because I think it could be potentially transformational for how we think about these issues and how we as a state can move forward and build that clean energy future that is very popular across political parties and brings in new jobs.
Thanks, Drew. I really do appreciate that. And because of the time, we're going to have to tackle the last question altogether. And I'll ask our speakers to try to keep your responses to just 20 seconds if you can. But drilling this back down to Houston, what needs to happen to accelerate energy innovation in Houston? We've been discussing how to create an ecosystem to begin to accelerate energy innovation in Houston. Let's discuss your perspectives on the next steps that need to happen in order to achieve that. And then finally, also tie into your response, what would you like for the Center for Houston's Future to focus on as a result of this conference and the work that they're doing? So anyone who wants to start off, please keep your answers concise.
I can begin. I'll say that, from the perspective of what I focus on, large infrastructure projects, a lot of the businesses in Houston happen to have large emitting facilities in the general Houston and Gulf Coast area. And one of the things that they can do to really accelerate things is to collaborate with each other and share infrastructure. Because, there's a lot of facilities where it's easy to grab the CO2, but then you have to do something with it. It needs transportation and storage infrastructure that in many cases does not exist today. And we try to encourage companies to come together and build shared infrastructure so they can allocate those costs over many, many different emitters so that it can be more cost effective, faster through that shared resource.
James, anyone else? Jetta?
So I'll just say that when Paula actually introduced me to Brett to speak on this panel, I was really excited about this because I know that Houston, as someone was saying earlier, has all of these amazing, traditional energy technology companies, but also new energy technology companies. And what I would encourage all of Houston and the center to think about is, how do you tap into the excitement and the work that the private sector is doing? How do you help them solve these problems? Maybe you talk with James about this infrastructure issue and see if there's some innovative ways that we can bring new technology or new collaboration, as he was saying, to the city. So I would say that's one of the most important things, is really engaging your private sector. And then the other thing is, I think that it's critically important, especially now. I mean, we understand that we have a crisis on our hands, but we also have an equity crisis, and we've had it for a very long time. And what is really important about cities and communities is for you to tap into the people that you have there and make sure that everyone is included. And so as a center that is focused on the city, I would really want to see you reach out to all of your communities, a diverse group of people, to make sure that they're all involved in this new energy transition.
Thanks.
I'll go quickly, and
Paula, go for it.
I'll put stomp both what James and Jetta said for efficiency's sake. And I will just say, you know, Houston sees this moment. This is what you do, Houston. You do big, complex things that are transformational, right? And through all of the mechanisms that James and Jetta have just set out, and also recognizing that there is increasingly very little distinction between clean tech and clean energy. So drawing any lines between those will only impede the cause. This is a massive mashup. Everybody needs to be on deck, because it's not just about competing with other communities in North America. This is a global competition. Lots of others are coming to the party. Activate, collaborate. Let's get moving.
Thanks, Paula. And Adam, any final thoughts?
Yeah, now I would just like to emphasize what Jetta and Paula have been saying throughout the conversation. Since we come from the basic science side of things, we're very interested in seeing how we can shorten the cycle time from basic science discovery to begin the innovation and development pathway. So whatever we can do in Houston to grow that infrastructure and that ecosystem, I think would benefit all of us.
Wonderful. And Drew, do you have anything you want to add there?
No, not anything that is any more eloquent than what has already been said, other than go Astros.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Well, with that, we are at time. There are a few questions that came into the Q&A chat. We will share those questions with the panelists and work on getting responses to you. But with that, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel and speakers. Thank you so much for your time and taking the time out of your busy days to come speak with us and our audience. The perspectives were tremendous and incredible insight. And it's just great to see just the diverse set of stakeholders we have working in a common fashion to move our energy industry forward and to address climate change and to help the Houston region become the energy transition capital of the world. So we really do thank all of you for your time. And thank you to our audience as well.
And Jose, I want to thank you.
Jose. Great job.
Thank you, Jose.
Thank you so much. And that was a great way to conclude this discussion. And I hope you'll stick around for what was really going to be an amazing conclusion to the conference, which is Franklin Chang. And he's going to talk, just like you were talking about, Paula, about, you know, how Houston can get stuff done. You know, we're the space center, and now we're going to become the headquarters for climate change. And Franklin's going to tell us about his amazing career of being an immigrant and an MIT PhD, having the most shuttle flights, and then finally what he's doing in terms of the challenge of going to Mars and then solving climate change in Costa Rica. So it's really quite an amazing story. So thank you guys for teeing this up, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric Berger. Those of you who have been in Houston for a while may know Eric as the science guy and from Space City Weather. And I'm going to let him introduce Franklin.